The operating room fell silent when the surgeon looked directly at the most feared man in the city and insulted him in a Sicilian dialect he thought nobody around him could understand. For 3 terrifying seconds, nobody moved. The nurses froze. The security guards reached instinctively toward their weapons. And the Mafia boss himself simply stared at the curvy surgeon standing beside his hospital bed, her hands still covered in blood from the emergency procedure she had just performed. Then something completely unexpected happened. He grinned. Not an angry grin. Not the cold smile of a man preparing revenge. It was almost amused, almost relieved, as if the words she had just thrown at him had awakened a memory he had buried for decades. "You really are Sicilian," he said softly. Dr. Clara Romano's heart stopped. She had insulted the most dangerous man in New York City. And somehow, he had understood every word. If you believe that kindness, courage, and second chances can change even the hardest hearts, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. Rain hammered the windows of St. Vincent Medical Center in Manhattan that night, turning the city lights into blurry golden streaks. Dr. Clara Romano had been working for nearly 16 hours when the emergency department suddenly exploded into chaos. 2 armed men rushed through the doors carrying a wounded man whose expensive black suit was soaked with blood. Behind them came several frightened security guards and a tall man with silver threaded through his dark hair. Everyone recognized him immediately. Marcus Bellini was a name whispered in restaurants, police stations, boardrooms, and expensive private clubs. Officially, he was a wealthy businessman who owned shipping companies, nightclubs, restaurants, and real estate across several states. Unofficially, people called him the Mafia boss. Clara had heard the rumors. Everyone had. She had also learned long ago that rumors were often more complicated than reality. Her father had been a surgeon. Her mother had worked as a nurse. Clara had grown up in a modest Italian-American neighborhood in Brooklyn, surrounded by people who spoke English at work and Sicilian at home. She had inherited her mother's curvy figure and her father's stubborn determination. During medical school, classmates had mocked her body, telling her that a serious surgeon should look more like a model than a woman who loved food and carried her strength visibly. Clara had cried about those comments in private, but she never allowed them to determine who she became. Now she stood in front of Marcus Bellini, and none of those old insults mattered. Someone was dying. "Move!" Clara ordered. Marcus's men hesitated. One of them tried to explain that the patient needed a private room, and that they had a doctor coming. Clara turned sharply and told them that if they wanted their friend alive, they needed to stop wasting her time. The authority in her voice surprised even the nurses. Marcus watched her carefully as she examined the wounded man. The patient had suffered severe internal bleeding, and every minute mattered. Clara pushed everyone aside and began working. For almost an hour, the operating room became a world of controlled urgency. Blood pressure dropped. Machines screamed warnings. Nurses moved instruments into her hands before she asked. Clara's forehead was covered in sweat, but her movements remained precise. She knew that if she made one wrong decision, a man would die on her table. Finally, the bleeding stopped. The patient survived. When Clara walked out of the operating room, Marcus was waiting in the corridor. His expensive coat was still wet from the rain, and his expression was unreadable. He thanked her with a quiet nod. Clara was exhausted, irritated, and still angry that his men had tried to control the hospital. Without thinking, she muttered a sharp Sicilian insult under her breath, something her grandmother used to say whenever a stubborn man behaved like he owned the world. She thought Marcus could not possibly understand it. He did. That was when he grinned. Clara immediately realized her mistake. Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice. He told her that his mother had spoken that exact dialect when he was a child. He had not heard those words spoken with that particular accent in almost 30 years. Clara expected anger, but instead she saw sadness behind his eyes. Marcus asked where she had learned it. Clara told him her grandmother had taught her. For the first time, The powerful man looked vulnerable. He admitted that his mother had been the only person who ever believed he could become a good man. She had died when Marcus was 17, and after her death, he had entered a world where fear became more useful than kindness. He had spent decades building an empire because he believed money and power could protect him from ever feeling helpless again. Clara looked at him differently after that. She still did not trust him. But she understood him. The next morning, Clara discovered that Marcus had anonymously paid the hospital bills of 12 patients who could not afford their surgeries. She assumed it was some kind of publicity stunt. Then she learned that there had been no cameras, no reporters, and no announcement. The hospital administrator told her the donation had been made through a private foundation. Weeks passed. Marcus began appearing at the hospital for legitimate business meetings, but Clara noticed that he always found some excuse to walk through the surgical department. Sometimes he brought coffee for exhausted nurses. Sometimes he quietly paid for medication for elderly patients. Once, Clara saw him sitting beside a frightened teenage boy whose mother was undergoing surgery. Marcus did not know the family. He simply stayed because the boy was alone. That moment changed something inside Clara. She realized that Marcus was not innocent. She never pretended otherwise. There were shadows in his past that money could not erase. But she also began to understand that a person could be guilty of terrible choices and still have the capacity to choose differently. Then one evening, Clara's younger brother, Michael, disappeared. Clara received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end told her that Michael had become involved with people connected to an illegal gambling operation. They wanted money. A lot of it. Clara had no money to pay them. Desperate, she went to Marcus. She expected him to demand something in return. Instead, he listened silently. Then he asked where Michael was last seen. Clara gave him the address. Marcus made a single phone call. Within an hour, Michael was found. He was frightened but alive. Clara could barely breathe when she saw her brother walk through the hospital doors. She rushed toward him, wrapped her arms around him, and cried against his shoulder. Marcus stood several feet away, watching quietly. Clara approached him afterward with tears still in her eyes. She asked why he had helped her. Marcus looked at her and said that years ago, his mother had taught him that if you have the power to stop someone's suffering and choose not to, then you become part of that suffering. Those words stayed with Clara. But Marcus's enemies were not pleased. Someone inside his organization believed that his growing attachment to Clara made him weak. They began sending threats. Clara's car was followed. Anonymous messages appeared on her phone. One morning, she found a photograph of herself leaving the hospital on her windshield. Marcus immediately offered protection. Clara refused. She told him she had spent her entire life fighting people who believed her size, her appearance, or her background made her weak. She would not spend the rest of her life hiding behind someone else's power. Marcus smiled sadly and told her that strength did not mean refusing help. That sentence reached deeper than he realized. Then the real danger arrived. One night, while Clara was performing an emergency surgery, the hospital lost power. Backup generators failed. The corridors went dark. Panic spread through the building. Clara was operating on a young mother when the surgical lights disappeared. For several terrifying seconds, all she could hear was the alarm of the heart monitor. Then a small emergency light came on. Clara continued. She remembered her father's words from childhood. A surgeon does not fight death with fear. She fights it with steady hands. Her hands remained steady. Outside the operating room, Marcus arrived with his security team. He quickly realized that the power failure was deliberate. Someone wanted Clara dead. Marcus could have left. Instead, he stayed. For the next 20 minutes, he stood outside the operating room while Clara fought to save the patient's life. When the surgery finally ended, Clara stepped into the corridor exhausted. Marcus looked at her. She looked at him. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Clara asked him why he had stayed. Marcus answered that he had spent his entire life believing people were valuable because of what they could offer him. She had taught him that some people were valuable simply because they cared about others. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Marcus then made the most unexpected decision of his life. He told her he was leaving the criminal world. Not because he suddenly believed himself to be a saint. Not because he expected forgiveness. But because he had finally met someone who made him want to become the man his mother had once believed he could be. It took months. There were investigations, legal meetings, painful confessions, and difficult consequences. Marcus cooperated with authorities regarding parts of his past and began dismantling the illegal operations connected to his empire. Some people betrayed him. Others threatened him. A few disappeared from his life completely. But Marcus stayed on the path he had chosen. Clara stayed beside him, cautiously at first. Their relationship did not begin with romance. It began with respect. She challenged him when he was wrong. He reminded her that accepting help was not weakness. She taught him how to laugh again. He taught her that being strong did not mean carrying every burden alone. 1 year after the night they first met, Marcus returned to St. Vincent Medical Center. He entered the surgical department carrying a small wooden box. Clara opened it and found an old photograph of a young Sicilian woman standing beside a teenage boy. Marcus told her it was his mother. On the back of the photograph were handwritten Sicilian words. Clara read them silently. They were the same words she had insulted him with on their first night. She looked up embarrassed. Marcus laughed. He told her that those words had become his favorite insult in the world because they had reminded him of home. Clara laughed through her tears. Then Marcus told her something she would remember for the rest of her life. He said that she had once insulted him in the language of his childhood, but instead of making him angry, she had reminded him that somewhere beneath the money, fear, and violence, there was still a frightened young man who had once wanted nothing more than to make his mother proud. Clara took his hand. And for the first time, Marcus Bellini allowed himself to cry. Not because he had lost. Because he had finally found his way back. Years later, St. Vincent Medical Center opened a new surgical wing funded by an anonymous donor. The wing was named after Marcus's mother. Clara became its chief surgeon. Michael became a paramedic. And Marcus, once feared across the city, spent the rest of his life quietly supporting medical charities, trauma centers, and families who could not afford treatment. People still whispered about his past. Some never forgave him. And perhaps they never should have. But Clara always believed that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. Forgiveness was sometimes simply allowing someone the opportunity to become different. One evening, years after their first encounter, Clara and Marcus stood outside the hospital watching the sunset over Manhattan. Marcus looked at her and smiled. He told her that if she had not insulted him that night, perhaps his life would have remained exactly the same. Clara laughed, and told him she still thought the insult had been deserved. Marcus grinned and answered that it probably was. Then he took her hand. And together they walked into the hospital, where another patient was waiting, another family was afraid, and another chance existed to choose kindness over fear. Before we end this story, if it touched your heart, please take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes people can change, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing emotional stories about courage, kindness, forgiveness, and second chances. And here is something special. Comment. Kindness can change a heart. If you believe that one act of compassion can completely change the direction of someone's life. Because sometimes the person standing in front of us is not the person they used to be. Sometimes they are simply waiting for someone brave enough to believe that they can become better. And sometimes, the unexpected words that change a life are not words of love at all. Sometimes they are words spoken in anger, words inherited from a mother, words remembered from home, and words that remind a lost soul who they once were. Marcus Bellini entered the hospital that night as a feared Mafia boss. He walked out as a man who finally wanted to become worthy of forgiveness,